Good morning again. It is a privilege to be with you. As you've heard, I'm Pastor Eric Schaefer. I am the pastor in residence for Global Refuge. I am a volunteer and I work part-time for Global Refuge, speaking to congregations, Lutheran and otherwise, in the West, in California, Nevada, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and wherever else somebody needs me to come, I come and talk about our work. And as Pastor said, we've been talking about this for months. When we set this up, we were thinking we were going to do a general introduction to Global Refuge, but of course the activities of the new administration in this past month make this talk a bit different, as you will hear. I live in Claremont, California, and the last call I served was in Santa Monica, California, but I've served all over the country and all over the world over my career, and so it's just a pleasure to be with you today. For nearly 3 years, I've been visiting congregations like yours, sharing the ministry of Global Refuge, which, as you heard, is the new name. Last year we changed our name to an agency that was called Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. And most Sundays that I've been out, I start with this true story. I started ministry in the 1970s, and my first call was to a small congregation called Holy Trinity Memorial Lutheran Church in the town of Catasauqua, Pennsylvania, which is a little town north of Allentown, Pennsylvania. Catasauqua was an old iron and silk town, which even in the 1970s, well, it was past its prime. And Holy Trinity was a tiny congregation. There were good people there, but the last pastor, it's so hard to say this kindly, let's just say it hadn't gone well for him. It was worse than that, but that's the nicest way of saying it. So we went there, and there was a lot of work to do. And shortly after I arrived, a representative of Lutheran Services of the Lehigh Valley, the local agency that worked with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, now Global Refuge, a representative of Lutheran Services called and asked if our congregation could assume sponsorship of a Vietnamese refugee family who had found, no surprise, a cheap apartment in our town, but that apartment in our town was far from the congregation that had sponsored them to come into the country. Well, I knew all about the so-called boat people and the massive refugee crisis in Southeast Asia following the end of the war in Vietnam, with Vietnamese fleeing communism and Cambodians fleeing government-sanctioned mass genocide. I knew all about this, but I also knew I was new, congregation's small, and we're still recovering from a lot. And frankly, my first reaction was I didn't think we could do it. I really didn't. But I didn't say no. I told the nice lady on the phone, I said, I'll get back to you. So, prayed about it, talked to my spouse about it, talked to our leaders about it, and I wasn't coming to any conclusion. And then by chance, my older brother Byron called. And so I told my brother about the situation and the request. And Byron said simply, what will you tell your grandchildren? What will you tell your grandchildren about this crisis and how you responded? Well, that did it. We took on the family, and as any of you know who've been involved in refugee sponsorship, it was a life-changing experience for those who worked with this family. Not long afterward, we sponsored 2 Cambodian refugee families who by chance became active members of our congregation. That's the story I've been telling for more than 2 years. And after I've told this story in all this time, I've suggested that we are in another one of those what will you tell your grandchildren time with the massive immigration and refugee crisis in the US and around the world. Afghans, Ukrainians, Haitians, Syrians, Venezuelans, Ecuadorians, and so many more, all fleeing war and violence of all kinds. And then there are even more coming across our southern border from 85 different nations. The global numbers, my friends, are mind-boggling. The last number I saw of the global refugee number was 115 million, but they had a caveat with that saying it's probably larger than that. More coming every day because of climate change and war. And then I've always asked again, what will we tell our grandchildren about how we responded to this crisis? And of course, every time I've said this in the past, my response is always the same. One way you might have something to tell your grandchildren is to become involved with Global Refuge. That involvement is a good way for each and every one of us to respond. Then I usually go into a history of Global Refuge. We've been around for 86 years, and we've worked with immigrants from all over the world, helping them resettle here in the USA. Pastor reminded me at the early service that after World War II, 1/6 of the world's Lutherans were refugees. And it's an interesting, so after World War II, the US government had a free ticket for any East German who was fleeing communism to come to this country, and our agency was the one who worked with those people coming in. And my travels, I met a 96-year-old woman who was on the last flight in 1954 with her babe in arms, who was now retirement age, and was part of that group of people that came in after World War II. But since then, we've worked with refugees from Hungary, Cuba, Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, and so many others. Over this time, we've settled 750,000 refugees. And that work continues today as we help Afghans, Haitians, Ukrainians, more recently Venezuelans, Ecuadorians, and others. We've resettled, just our agency, 20,000 refugees in 2024, and we did that through 55 resettlement centers across the country. And I always say that refugees can still be sponsored by congregations and even families, and that information is on our website if you're interested. But there's so many other things that Global Refuge does that you can be involved in. Global Refuge has helped the tens of thousands of children under age 18 who come across the border without their parents, without anyone each year. You might remember from the first Trump administration the children in cages. And back those 6 years ago, the federal government asked Global Refuge to find foster care for these children, and very quickly we found foster care homes for 5,600 children. We're still working with that. That's one of our biggest government contracts. Last year, we helped 21,000 minor children who were alone here in this country. We've also tried something new. We've opened a center in Guatemala, and we're opening one in Mexico to work with children who are sent back, but also to work with those countries so that people don't have to leave, that they might have a better life there. We've operated 3 welcome centers across the country for immigrants, those seeking asylum, so that they can get through this difficult, long process. We recently started a bank to make microloans to immigrant families so a family could start a business. You won't be surprised, mostly women starting businesses out of their homes. And we've worked with U.S. businesses who are hungry for workers. There are about 10 million jobs available in the U.S., and they're all jobs that current citizens do not wish to take and that immigrants are willing to take. And I've always concluded that you can find information on all this, as well as suggestions for prayer and study, for financial support, for outreach to people in detention centers, for local, state, and national advocacy with leaders, and much more, all on our website, globalrefuge.org. I've always suggested that one thing anyone can do is sign up for our e-newsletter to keep informed, so you have accurate information. You can do that on our website, globalrefuge.org. There's also a tablet on the back in the narthex where you can sign up today along with others who signed up to get our e-newsletter. And I've said, when I've said all these things, that it's one way we might have something to tell our grandchildren. Now, that's what I've been doing for the past 2.5 years, traveling around, telling the story of our ministry, seeking support, prayers, information. But today, this Sunday, things are very different. Over the past month, the Trump administration has made 3 dramatic changes in how organizations such as Global Refuge can work with approved refugees, changes which will not only change, but could threaten or curtail much of our work. The first change, which President Trump made on his first day, one of his first executive orders, was to cut the number of approved refugees who could enter the U.S. in 2025 to 0. That number has never been 0, and this was the first time. But the president has the right to set that. In recent years, that number has been between 100,000 and 200,000 each year. After the drastic reductions during President Trump's first term, he got the number down to 14,000 his last year. We finally got this figure back to the traditional number of about 125,000 last year. And as I mentioned, Global Refuge sponsored through our congregations 20,000 of these. Now, it's important to understand when I share this information, these are not so-called illegal aliens coming across the southern border. These are not people who are undocumented or are here without permission. These are the annual number of refugees this nation has admitted every year since 1965, when the Immigration Act of 1965 set quotas for nations around the world, how many each year each nation could allow to leave to come to the U.S. The 65 Act was actually pretty progressive for its time. For the first time, it set quotas for Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and so it was less racist than the past act. These are folks who have waited some 5, 10, or 15 years to entry. They've had exhaustive background checks. The State Department has people around the world who interview these people, does background checks, criminal checks, health checks. There are no terrorists or criminals among them. These are the people that you've helped settle over the years, the 750,000 the Global Refuge has settled, the 20,000 we settled last year. Now, going to 0 is terrible news. It's a big part of our work, as you can imagine, and it's very sad. But to be honest, we were sort of expecting it. And then it got worse. On the second day, President Trump canceled the permission of refugees to come to this country who were previously approved and were on their way. What I'm telling you is people with airline tickets in their hands at airports throughout the world were stopped. Some 5,000 to 6,000 people. These were people who've been waiting for 5, 10, 15 years, often in refugee camps, often far from their former homes. And they had the airport. There were people in this country, relatives, congregations waiting to receive them. The people had the plane tickets, they got to the airport and were told, you can't enter. We don't know what happened to these people, because most likely they couldn't go back to the refugee camp because the refugee camp had probably filled that position. 5,000 to 6,000 people, we have no idea what happened to them. That is just cruel. You couldn't imagine much worse, and then it got even worse. At the end of the administration's first week, the State Department at 4 o'clock on a Friday sent us and all the other refugee agencies, there's 10 of them, including Global Refuge, an order that we had to stop helping the refugees who were already here, who we had congressionally approved funds to serve. Traditionally, the approved refugees, those 20,000 that we sponsored last year, and the 120,000 across the country, sponsored by other agencies, traditionally refugees are given a small stipend for the first 3 months, no longer, to get them started. Food, housing, transportation, basics. We had 6,000 refugees under our care who were within those first 3 months, and we were told, even though the money had been approved, that we couldn't help them, where they were cut off. These are people, my friends, who are going to be homeless. They're going to be hungry. And these numbers include Afghans who helped us in the war, Ukrainians fleeing their homes being bombed out. This is just cruel. And it's really easy, let me tell you, living with this every day, it's really easy to be hopeless and feeling helpless. But we are not helpless. There's at least 4 things that most of us here today can do, and I'm sure we can think of others. Right now, our biggest need, quite frankly, is money. We're trying to raise $5 million to help the 6,000 people under our care get 1 month of help. We're having some success already, and so we need donations. I can take them today, checks made out payable to Global Refuge or cash. You can do it through our website. I know your congregation is considering a larger gift very soon. There are lots of ways you can help with this. Frankly, we just need help to help the ones so they don't starve that are under our care. Secondly, maybe you can't help financially, but secondly, most of us can let our people in Congress know. Now, we're in an area that has liberal senators and a lot of liberal Congress people, but they need to know too. I think you know this. People in Congress count the emails. They count the phone calls. They actually weigh the letters. So people that want to help us and those that don't need to hear from us. We need to let Congress know, don't lose track of this. There's been so many executive actions by the president, it's easy to get lost. Don't lose this. The request is free up the money that was already granted by Congress for helping refugees who are already here. In our case, it's $28 million that they're holding back. Free up that money. It was paid for out of last year's budget. It's already approved by Congress. And tell your friends. Tell your coworkers, tell the students at school. Let everybody know this. I go out and I'm surprised how few people know this is going on. Tell your friends. Let your congresspeople know. Thirdly, we can all keep ourselves informed. As I mentioned, one good way to keep yourself informed is to sign up for our e-newsletter, which you can do on our website, but you can also do on the sign-up sheet in the narthex. It's to the right as you leave. And there are other materials on Global Refuge there, including some pens and stickers and our wonderful Psalm 46 pins, and you may take those if you wish as you leave. So that's the third thing we can do, keep informed. And fourth, we have to underpin all these efforts with prayer. You know, we're Lutherans, we're Christians, we do believe in prayer. We do believe prayer makes a difference. I am praying every day, sometimes multiple times a day, for a change of heart by the leaders in Washington. Now, that may be a long shot, but I don't consider that an idle prayer by any means. I ask you to join me in praying for a change of heart on refugees, and probably there are other things you might want to pray for, but refugees especially of our leaders in Washington. I also think we should pray for these refugees, and please pray for our staff. We now have 65 people who are without jobs. There'll be more. Church World Services laid off all their staff. Episcopal Relief Services has laid off all their staff. It's tough times. And then all our local social service agencies who worked with us with refugees have had to lay off staff because there's no money to pay them too. Now, the assigned texts for this Sunday, the seventh Sunday after the Epiphany, include, as you just heard me read, Jesus' teaching about loving enemies and strangers from Luke 6. Do good, Jesus says, even to your enemies. Give to everyone who asks for help, and don't expect anything in return. Be merciful, love, forgive everyone. Now, Jesus may not specifically this time mention immigrants and the stranger, but these words, I think, are clear instructions by Jesus on how we should relate to everyone, including the immigrant, the alien, and the stranger. Now, more specifically, though, care for the immigrant, the alien, and the stranger is actually in our basic texts of the Bible. In the New and Old Testament, that concern, that command is mentioned over 100 times. It's clear on these texts, and it's also clear in the texts of the other Abraham traditions, Judaism and Islam. It's clear in all our texts that concern for the immigrant and the stranger is central to our faith. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that you really can't be a Christian, or a Jew or a Muslim for that matter, that you can't be a Christian without a concern for the stranger, the alien, and the immigrant. Involvement with Global Refuge is one way we can all respond in some way to these commands. Now, just one more thought. Whatever happens, Global Refuge has been around for 86 years, and we're not going anywhere. We plan to be around long after this new administration or any administration is long out of office. And you can count on that.